Welcome to the premiere episode of my new podcast, Tender Rage, the show for the outrageously audacious, the loudly passionate and the slightly delusional, a podcast for anyone with ordinary courage. I'm your host, Sunny Adcock, a 20-year-old from Sydney, Australia, the friend best known for keeping you well hydrated and oversharing pop culture facts. I'm a fangirl, a feminist, a writer and reader, a sister, and a cancer baby of mixed race heritage. Tender Rage is my safe, all-inclusive space to celebrate and share the radical emotions that are so often demonized in our communities. Passion, resistance, joy, fury. A space to hold sacred the nuanced and often conflicting emotions that define our experiences of coming of age. I'm so grateful for the journey that we're beginning together throughout this exciting first season. And as we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians and knowledge keepers of the land where this show was produced and recorded, and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I would also like to warn listeners that this episode contains references to racism, sexism, queerphobia, and police brutality. The following conversation serves as part one of our two-part premiere, so brew a cuppa and have a listen as we keep the rage tender. Welcome to today's episode of Tender Rage. I am positively delighted to let y'all know that today we have the fabulous Hebah Ali joining us to discuss Harry Styles and masculinity. For those of you who don't know Hebah Ali, well, firstly, you should thank me later. Hebah Ali is a director, screenwriter, filmmaker, photographer, production and costume designer who is all sorts of excellence. She is the light of my life, and she just recently wrapped on her short film Grezzy. Hebah, how are you today?
I'm wonderful. How are you, Sunny?
I'm so freaking excited that you're here. Can you tell us a little bit about that production?
Of course. What a great introduction, firstly. My short film Grezzy, as you just said, I just wrapped on it. And it's pretty much a story about the merging of cultures in the West. So it follows a young immigrant dad called Fahad who's teaching his daughter Sulfi English through American sitcom TV, because through life experience, I know myself and a lot of other people learned English through TV and cartoons and that kind of thing. So, it was important for me to kind of bring that to light a little.
And as someone who knows you and gets to watch you just glow, from a distance and up close, one of the things that I love is that you always center the stories of people of color. As a Pakistani and Fijian Indian Muslim woman, your perspective is so valuable and so interesting. So I'm wondering, when will we be able to watch this and where?
Ooh, thank you so much. And of course, centering people of colour and also creatives of colour behind the camera and also in front of the camera is really important to me. But to answer your question, we're hoping in April we'll be finished and we'll have a screening sometime around then. We won't be releasing it online because we will be doing the festival circuit. If you want to keep up to date with where we're at with Grezzy, you can follow our Instagram at Grezzy Short Film.
Beautiful, and we most definitely be plugging the dates that they can go and see this film on our Instagrams as well, so stay tuned. So today we're talking about the love of our... Okay, how do I say this? We are the love of each other's lives, but we have a shared love of our life, if that makes sense. That's
Yes.
not each other. Our shared boyfriend. And that is Harry Styles.
Harry Edward Styles.
Harry Edward Styles.
Where do we begin?
Where do we begin? Do you want to explain how we met from your perspective? And I'll say it from my perspective, because I feel like we can't begin this discussion about Harry Styles without touching on how we met.
Of course. So I actually met Sunny by chance at a event held by Flex Mami, and I was there with one of my great friends, Aya, who was a mutual friend of Sunny's from way back when.
Mm-hmm.
And I had seen Sunny on my Instagram, here and there. We have mutual friends But I knew it was her when I saw her, but I just like wanted to make sure. Hi, I'm Hebah. Like, and we just like kind of introduced ourselves to each other. And then I think Sunny saw my lock screen, which was Harry Styles. And then this conversation about Harry and like fangirling ensued. And honestly, we've never looked back since then.
It was such a fun night, and it was so interesting because it was like such a just like by a stroke of like chance and luck that we met each other that night. The mutual friend who connected us, I hadn't seen her in years. So I was so excited just to see her. And then I saw you and I was like, oh, this girl looks really cool. I think a lot of girls listening to this will relate to when you see a girl who looks really cool, you're like, I just want to be her friend. And so we were sort of chatting and merging groups. And then she pulled her phone out really casually. And I saw, I don't even remember what image it was, but Harry Styles was the lock screen. And I was like, holy shit. And I was like, it takes a certain kind of super fan to be comfortable having the celebrity that you stan as like your lock screen, not just your home
100%,
screen.
100%. It took me a minute to kind of be like, no, I'm actually proud to have this as my lock screen. Because for the longest time I was hashtag not like other girls.
Of course, yeah.
And then I had like a normal lock screen and you would open it up and you would be Harry on the home screen. But I'm glad, imagine I hadn't had that on the lock screen. You probably would have never seen it and we probably would have just parted ways.
I don't know how we would have eventually we would have found out that that was an interest that we both had in common. But I think the extent, like, because I remember once I saw that, we mentioned that we both had tickets to go to his Love on Tour shows that have now been postponed.
Let's not bring that up.
Huge sad react. And you mentioned that you had tickets to go and see him in New York on July 6th, which was my birthday. And had I not just been about to leave for America, my goal was to go to that show. It's like, imagine seeing Harry Styles in New York, the dream place, on your 20th birthday. Obviously that didn't happen, but I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't tell people that I wanted to do that because I was like, they're going to think I'm crazy. And then
you met someone equally crazy.
Who absolutely matched that level.
Yeah, no, look, I'm a huge believer in matching energies, and I'm so sorry that you never had anyone in your life before me. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, you unearthing those New York dreams and memories for me really, really hits a sore spot. But I think COVID willing, you and I will definitely see our king in New York City.
Yes,
someday.
It'll happen. I'm manifesting it.
Yes.
I want to know, obviously, I feel like when people clicked onto this episode, they probably had a couple of different reactions. Either they were Harry super fans, so they're going to eat up any content that is Harry related, or they're friends of us, which is amazing. Thank you for listening to an episode about a pop star that you might not like, just for us. Or you might be curious, because here at Tender Rage, we like to do things differently. We like to intersect our passion and our fandom and our joy with our activism and our rage. And so we always want to approach things from a sort of academic, nuanced perspective. And that's also inclusive of our fangirling. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation about what Harry Styles means to society as a pop culture figure and how he has changed the conversation that surrounds modern masculinity. But before we get into the itty-gritty, I absolutely need to know, when and how did you first discover One Direction?
I'll be honest, it was year 7. My friend Sarah, so shout out to Sarah if she's listening. She had discovered them first. She was there through X Factor days.
Whoa.
So she's quite indie at the time.
That's the hugest flex.
That is the hugest flex. I discovered them post X Factor, I'll be honest. But Sarah was the one who kind of introduced me to them. And it was right after What Makes You Beautiful had come out. And I was like, yeah, I'll give this a listen. And I watched the music video. I will be honest, head over heels for Zayn.
I can't blame you.
Initially. And lots of little reasons why. He was also like the only Muslim person, not only person in the band, but like pop star that I'd ever seen. And he was very attractive, kind of my age. It's like, we can make it happen. And yeah, so he kind of like roped me into the fandom life. But then, yeah, as I kind of grew, I grew out of being a Zayn girl and now the Harry girl that I am today. Lots of moments on that journey to get me there. But what about you? What was your 1D origin story?
It's funny because it was actually kind of similar to yours. It was after What Makes You Beautiful, the music video, had launched as well. I remember I was in year 6 and we had this one teacher that we really loved. Shout out to the Summerhill gang, who she didn't really let us stay in her classroom during lunch, but we kind of did. And we felt cool because it was like we were being edgy and whatever. And so we stayed in the classroom at lunchtime unsupervised, and we used her computer to play YouTube. Because I don't know if Sydney Siders will remember this, but there was a time on like the DET portal where you couldn't access YouTube.
This sounds like the most mid-2000s thing ever.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like all we wanted in life was to be able to use YouTube at school. Anyway, so we used her log on, and one of my friends, she was like, oh, hey, check this out. And she played it. And I just was looking at the screen. This was the first time I had ever seen it. And from there, I was like, I must know every single thing about them.
Of course. Of course. And what a powerful single. Like, what a powerful introduction.
Right?
The first little dun, dun, dun. Oh, my God. Gets me going to this day. It really, like, muscle memory. I'm just like, stuck right now.
It was such a cultural reset. And it's like, it's funny thinking about it now as an adult, because it's like, they're trying to tell us that our most beautiful feature is that we're insecure. Gross. But I'm still going to listen to the song on repeat and feel totally like they're singing to me.
Yes, 100%. As we say, feminism in the bin.
Feminism in the bin. We're going to hip you onto this. So we're both ardent feminists and we'll ride with women until we die. But sometimes with these conversations, our feminism goes in the bin. And we just ask for your forgiveness.
And yeah, look, it's just something that's going to happen possibly throughout the podcast. But just know that it does happen in our personal conversations. And we're going to be quite transparent about that.
Exactly. We're not trying to be cancelled when you'll find out how we are. So we're just going to present ourselves to you fully right now.
So transparent.
It's really funny that you say Zayn. You were a Zayn girl initially. People always laugh at me when I say this. I was initially a Louis girl.
No, I did not. Wait, I don't know this about you. I just
exposed.
You were always in my mind a Harry girl.
It makes a lot of sense that I would be a Harry girl. Louis didn't really make sense.
It does. Look, nothing without.
She's like, let's unpack.
Without offending anybody. Nothing about standing Louis Tomlinson makes sense to me. I think he's a great artist, but I think especially. I think I could have understood like towards the beginning of the 1D era. But for me, it was always like Zayn, Harry. I can see Niall too. I just felt like during the peak of 1D, Louis was just always like the oldest.
Yeah.
And so I felt like he's kind of like a bit out of the realm of like standing. But look, I've been proven wrong and you're sitting right in front of me. What can I say?
I literally owned... And don't act like I'm creepy, guys. I was like 12. I literally owned a life-size Louis poster.
No!
And I remember the day that I folded it up and was like, okay, it's time to put it away.
It's time to grow up.
It's time to grow up. Probably the same day I got my period. It was still within the Up All Night era that I shifted to Harry. And I think it was probably once I got deeper in my research and into the fandom, 1D pop-ups, tried to get the concert tickets, and of course they sold that in like 1 second, as if I could even afford them. And the fact that he was just so charming. But I want to know for you, being a Zayn girl, which obviously makes so much sense. I think we're all still Zayn girls and are all quietly bitter about it because he's the one that got away.
Truly.
I love to hate him and I hate to love him.
Look, I love that relationship. I have a similar... Okay, I have many grievances towards Zayn. And this is like absolutely just my 13-year-old heart, right? Like whoever he is now, like I'm obviously really proud of him.
He's a zaddy.
Obviously married, has a child with Gigi. I don't know how you could get further up from there.
No.
But I remember when during the beginning times, obviously loads of Pakistani Muslim girls were like, oh my God, in a way, kind of representation, which is another topic altogether. But I think we all saw him as that cute boy that you would see in your community and be like, oh, he's really cute, and create little scenarios in your head about him. Of course. And then obviously as his time with the band kind of progressed, you kind of saw him come away from religion a little bit and, kind of find himself in this new space that he was surrounded in with different people. And outside of his like culture and community and that kind of thing.
I can imagine as well, especially because like we're still quite a far away from getting true racial diversity in pop culture and in media in general. But when One Direction was a thing, we were even further from it. So I could imagine like your affinity to Zayn in having that shared identity would have been so huge. Definitely. And probably would have also influenced your position in the or your perspective on fandom. I know any fandom that I've ever been heavily engaged in, there has always been a small like micro war between the ethnic fans and the white fans, especially when you're young and you really care about who they're dating, because definitely. Well, all the fan fictions have a white girl with blonde messy buns, and just like whenever you're like, oh, I ship them with this person, their sort of racial bias just comes out.
Yeah.
And so I want to know, before we jump back into Harry, like, was your perspective sort of as a fan of colour, was that something that you were conscious of during your time in the 1D fandom?
Definitely. And like it's so wild that you bring up the fan fiction thing of like, you know, all the protagonists being like, have you seen those tweets where they're like, he like stroked her blonde hair? Like, okay, instantly torn from this story.
Literally.
It was very much that case, but I'm just remembering now there was this one fan fiction that I would like love keeping up to date with, and it was the Zayn one.
Of course.
And it was super like diverse. It was written by this like Pakistani girl, and it was like I saw aspects of like my culture, and like it was very well written, and I was like, wow, I've never seen this. I probably will never see it again. And I really like hung on to that. But just on your note about that, I feel like having Zayn in the band was really a game changer, because I was just putting my mind back to like when Justin Bieber first became really popular. That space was very like taken up by white girls, and I was like briefly a Justin Bieber fan. I wouldn't say I was ever a stan, but I felt like my kind of feelings towards, I guess, a pop idol at that time almost felt like not real, only because I didn't see other people like me who were like those kind of fans. And so obviously like you'd get like, oh, you're like the token white fan, like as in like in my community and family, they'd be like, oh, you're like the white girl who is like into Justin Bieber or whatever. But then when 1D came on the scene and Zayn did, with that brought so many like Muslim fans and like Pakistani girls and women who were like really into, I guess, Zayn, but also the band. And I was like, oh my God, like we all have this like one shared person that we love. And that felt like really, really cool and really great. And it was such a great formative like experience, I feel, because you know how I guess now we've all, or I guess we're still coming into ourselves, but like for the most part, we're trying to decolonize the content and, you know, things that we consume. And I'm glad that back then, from when I was younger, that I did have a little taste of that experience. Not that it was like to any great extent, because, you know, I do feel like Zayn was whitewashed by like the management and like the fans and like all of that. But like it was still a great little like piece of 1D that you could like hold to your heart. Very cute.
That's so special. And I think you touched on something really relevant to so many fans of colour, is being accused of being whitewashed for sort of standing mainstream bands or idols that were majority white all the time.
Yeah, 100%. And like I 100% know that you have dealt with the same thing as well. And it's just like always that constant battle of being like, no, but like I think it's really cool, aside from like what other people think.
Exactly. Especially because in being a fangirl, you know, you're already demonized for your sort of unbridled passion because of the sexist ideals that are out there that tell us how a woman should behave. But then when you add racial bias onto that, when, you know, women of colour are excluded completely from the narrative of what it means to be a woman and are then policed in a different way, there's a whole other level of sort of discrimination or prejudice, I guess you could say, that you experience being a fan of colour engaging in behaviour that is considered unladylike.
Definitely. I would love to keep my fangirling, like when I wasn't with my friends, like on the down low. Like my guy cousins and stuff like that would like tease me about loving like Zayn or One Direction and stuff. So I would kind of just have that internalized like misogyny of like, no, like I don't really like them that much. Like I think I like that one song I think that they put out, like something about being
like
beautiful.
Maybe.
Yeah. But like other than that, like I'm really into like Fall Out Boy and stuff. Like it's just such a big me. But it was also like a moment of like trying to protect myself from being like homogenized into like this group of like No, just being homogenized as like the white teenage girl, fangirl type thing that we often see.
Especially like you spoke earlier about that whole I'm not like other girls, which I think unfortunately we all go through. But I feel like that would be even deeper when, you know, you already sort of have an internalized idea about how males perceive you when you are othered at school for being racially different, that you don't want to add another level of quote unquote embarrassment onto it. You know, like you kind of feel like, oh, well, if at least I can't have an edge up on the, you know, the rest of the white girls that they adore, then at least I'm going to be like a cool indie chick.
Yeah, because you really got to pick your battles with it. You're like, which card am I playing today?
It's really all about survival.
Exactly. And yeah, I like that we've grown with it though. And like we've kind of been like, you know what? Let's reconcile these two parts of ourselves or multiple parts of ourselves to be like, no, we can be this and that and that and that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, love
multifaceted till the end.
Queens.
As we've discussed how sort of pivotal Zayn was in your experience as a fangirl and as a directioner more specifically. Warning, feminism in the bin.
Warning, this episode contains many feminism in the bin moments.
Many feminism in the bin moments. When was the moment you became a white man's for Harry Styles?
Oh, wow. I think when HS1, Harry Styles 1 debut album, for those who aren't familiar.
For the locals.
Yeah, the locals. When that came out, I was like kind of like vibing it, but I was never really like my white king. Like I was like, this
oh, how things change.
Lol. Both of us sitting here in our Harry shirts. Fantastic. But I think it was kind of towards when, a little bit before Lights Up came out, when he was like teasing like all of this new music, I was like very interested and intrigued. And I think a lot of the reason was I felt like his first debut album, HS1, was, it was very him trying to break away from the boy band image. And I felt like he was being someone who he thought he should be.
Interesting.
Whereas with Fine Line and like this Fine Line era, it just feels so authentic and so him that when Lights Up came out and when the video for that came out, I was like, wow, like he had this in him all this time. And it's just so different from like all of the other stuff he's been doing. Because looking back onto the first album, a lot of the tracks felt quite similar with Fine Line. Like a lot of the tracks they're all different in their own way.
So drastically different.
And I feel like seeing him become so comfortable and grow into himself was like so lovely. And like, not just as a fan, but just like as a person, like it's also that story of like, he got famous when he was like 16 and he's almost 27 now?
Yeah, 27 now.
And like seeing that progression is obviously really lovely and sweet. But in terms of like actually being like, would lay down my life for him, I think when I got to know him as a person, like I was like seeing all the interviews and obviously I would watch every single One Direction interview.
It's the only way to do it.
Sun, seeing the way he would always just be defending like the fans and kind of always, despite being given that womanizer label, always just show the utmost respect to like women in all spaces. I didn't really see many of the other band members do that.
Yeah, definitely.
And not that like he should be like hailed for doing it. Like it really is the bare minimum. But he was just more forthcoming with that. And I was like, yeah, maybe he does deserve my everything about me.
Which is a huge part of his appeal. Like I would agree with you. It's so nice to see his sort of transition and his journey, his metamorphosis, because granted, yes, he is his own individual with his own talent and ambition. But like, I think us fans feel a lot of pride in his journey and a lot of, for lack of a better word, responsibility, because I don't think people understand that like the fans created One Direction. Like their mass success is completely due to teenage girls on the internet.
Definitely.
We gave them an unprecedented level of fame. And it was our sort of first brush with agency as young girls. You know, even when we were demonized for it, it gave us a real look at the power that we had. And so I think to have someone who was able to have the success that he had and then still come back to his roots and still respect his fan base and not want to neglect us while expressing himself artistically in a different way was really wonderful and really lovely.
100%. And I think Harry in particular has always been conscious of that. Not to say the other band members don't, but I feel like that he acknowledges and shows his appreciation for it the most. And like we were discussing before, like he's always the one playing like 1D hits at his like concerts, at his like standalone gigs and stuff. So he, I think, is always has always been very appreciative of that as well. And just going back to like how he would kind of like defend us in his interviews, and I think he pulled like a really cool quote. Was it from his Vanity Fair?
Maybe Rolling Stones.
Yeah,
I'd love for you to read it out.
Yeah,
I want this quote on a t-shirt.
Honestly. When the interviewer asked him like if he worries about like credibility now as a solo artist, because he had the pop idol image attached to him and like obviously having lots of fangirls. And what he responded was like very lovely and very Harry Styles trademark. So I quote, "Who's to say that young girls who like pop music, short for popular, right, have worse musical taste than a 30-year-old hipster guy? That's not up to you to say. Music is something that's always changing. There's no goalposts. Young girls like the Beatles, you're going to tell me they're not serious? How can you say young girls don't get it? They're our future doctors, lawyers, mothers, presidents. They kind of keep the world going. Teenage girl fans, they don't lie. If they like you, they're there. They don't act too cool. They like you and they tell you, which is sick."
The way that we're like fed such scraps normally, that in hearing that, I'm like ready to tattoo it on my chest.
Honestly, you said it before, but get me that on a shirt.
Literally, I want it on a shirt. And I think that was actually his Rolling Stone interview, which was like such an important one too, because as anyone in the fandom would know, anytime before he releases an album, he has like a huge sort of tell-all interview in Rolling Stones. Is it Rolling Stones or Rolling Stone?
Rolling Stones.
Rolling Stones, yeah. There's multiple. There's a gang of them. And I think that was a really interesting decision because especially since Rolling Stones is recognized as like a really cool, serious publication, he could have really used that opportunity to rebrand himself as somebody who is exclusively looking for a mainstream male audience and who is not to be associated with young and passionate girls. And the fact that he decided to so staunchly defend them, I think, is really indicative of his appreciation for the fandom and just how grounded he is for a pop star who has received such an insane level of success.
With that as well, like him remaining true to like his values and to the fans and stuff, I think lots of other people felt that as well, because I was having a discussion with one of my friends and the question came up of like, out of all the 1D solo artists, like who do you like the most? And he said like Harry Styles. Obviously, you know, people like Louis or even Liam feel more, I guess, masculine, quote unquote, or like they look like the artists that men would be into more.
Yes.
Yet Harry, being who he is and how he presents himself, still attracts a lot of male attention and like a lot of male fans as well, which I think is very interesting because we haven't seen anything like that with Justin Bieber or even I'm trying to think of like other male pop people, but those are the two, like the notable ones that I can think of.
Definitely for our generation.
Yeah. So I thought that was pretty interesting as well.
That's really true. And it's funny because despite doing this, his critics have had no choice but to still recognize him as serious and as talented, as someone who is worthy of his fame, you know, outside of his participation in a boy band, which I think is really important, that in getting this recognition, it's kind of that validation that after being judged for all those years, we were onto something. We weren't just blinded by his good looks, like we have taste. And sometimes it can feel like a slap in the face that it's taken until now, when male music journalists have decided to affirm his talents for the rest of the world to agree that he's serious too. But no one will forget, least of all Harry, that we were the ones who got him there and who saw his talent first.
Definitely. And look, we love him for that. He's not the artist to kind of be like, oh, well, I'm pretty cool and kind of hot stuff now. Like we can kind of just forget how I got here. He's very mindful of that, which I really appreciate from him.
We had a really interesting discussion about the fact that it's so funny that in the band, he is maybe seen as the least masculine and yet is the member with the most amount of sex appeal surrounding him, because during his time in the band, his sort of PR branding or his sort of position in the group was the charming one, the womanizer and the flirt. You know, he quite repeatedly dated a lot of older women. He dated a lot of models. He was charismatic and confident. He was more sort of expressive in his clothing choices. And even then at the beginning, that was the bare minimum. You know what I mean? Like he really was just out here in his staples, and yet he still sort of had an individuality that was markedly different from the rest of his peers, who I love them all. But it's so funny because that's such that label never was something that he ascribed to or something that he provoked himself. It was very media driven, and any fan of his knew that that wasn't the case, and that he's always expressed dismay for being over-sexualized and for being seen as this macho guy who was misogynist in a way. Not that people claimed he was misogynist, but I feel like it's hard to be labeled a womanizer and not also be thought of as a misogynist.
Definitely.
Which is so strange because he was the only member in the band who openly from day dot expressed feminist sentiments and defended women and refused to sort of
be boxed into what he was being boxed into.
Exactly.
And I also think it's important to note that while he had this like womanizer label, he was still really, really young. He was the youngest person in the band.
Yeah, people forget that.
Yeah, I think it's quite unfair for a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old, someone who's not even of age, to be having this label of like very promiscuous and, you know, sexualized. And also obviously the issues with him dating older women as well. That's a separate topic. But I can imagine it would have been very confusing and maybe stressful for him to kind of be like, well, this is how the world and like media and even sometimes the fans are seeing me, but this is not who I am. And I think a lot more of that was kind of reinforced when the kind of fan fiction surrounding him was very kind of rooted in like him being this like really controlling, like misogynistic boyfriend or, you know, partner. And obviously these stories would be written by fans and by women. And so they were kind of putting that image onto him, which I think would have been very stressful for him, because he's like, what have I done to give this impression of myself to the fans? And in these stories, like it's very much a toxic relationship that we're seeing. And he's never really given us a reason to believe that he would be like that. So I think it's really interesting that even like the fans themselves have put this identity on him, and breaking out of that as well would have been such a task. But I think he's managed to do so as well, like in his current image now.
And I imagine it would have been like incredibly odd knowing that the band profited from him having that image. And I imagine when he appears at least to be personally opposed to those sorts of behaviors and attitudes and ways of looking at women, to then see that some young fans seem to want that from him, because that toxic persona was definitely romanticized in fan fiction. I think the majority of fan fiction showed him as this toxic bad boy, dark exclamation point Harry, as a lot of readers would be familiar with. I mean, particularly After is the most notable one. I feel like there can't be a conversation about his image without discussing After. Anyone who lives under a rock, don't worry, if you do, we still love you. The movie series After was originally published on Wattpad by Anna Todd and was a Harry Styles fan fiction. He went from Harry Styles in the fan fiction to Hardin Scott, which I find really funny. They didn't even try to hide it. But it was funny because when we were discussing this earlier, we were like, why as women with agency beginning our feminist journeys, why did we have the feminism in the bin? I mean, personally, actually, I never was drawn to dark Harry fictions as much as I'm a feminist in the bin. When it comes to like writing and stories and relationships, I just, the feminism in me is just impossible to remove.
Definitely.
It's gorilla glued on. But we were trying to unpack why that was, that there was definitely a mass market for it. And although we've shifted away from it, it was truly something that existed back then. And I think it's because we are told by the media through portrayals of love in film and television that we need to be ready to accept sort of troubled romance, and that desire is the same thing as love, and that sort of possessiveness
is like an attractive quality.
Yeah, it's an attractive quality.
Things like ownership even is the way that, you know, women should aspire to be loved.
Definitely.
Because anything less than that is not love. And that is such an interesting and like really sad concept that we were socialized into, especially as 100%. Young girls. But I'm glad that, you know, a lot of us now have, even with the series like After, seeing that play out in real time now as a 22-year-old or whenever it came out, it would have been a bit younger. seeing how problematic all of that stuff is, and thinking that, you know, someone my age at 14, 15 would have thought that was like the pinnacle of romance or the pinnacle of like love, and then go and kind of pursue things that mirrored what we would be reading online.
Definitely.
So yeah, it's very troubling.
Obviously, like After wasn't the only franchise to do this, but I think all of the films that featured relationships like this were just agents of patriarchy, in the sense of, by desensitizing us to this sort of treatment and to this sort of unhealthy types of relationships, it meant that men didn't have to do better, and that we as a society didn't collectively need to sort of reorient our perspective on love, and on self-worth, and on sort of safety and well-being. While there were authors who wrote about Harry in a more true fashion, I think for the most part, like, we just would not know how to recognize and receive healthy love at that age, because we just didn't see it around us. We weren't told to sort of have boundaries, have standards, to not accept someone's behavior just because they say it's their way of showing love. We wouldn't know how to accept that. We weren't taught to. And so I think in a warped way, this is the only thing as young women that we knew how to navigate, whether or not we truly wanted it.
Definitely. And I think it's also important to note as well, for these young girls, and when I say these, I also mean us when we were that age, we maybe would have made allowances for this kind of behavior because it was like this person that we loved so much, like Harry Styles. And it would have been so easy for him to buy into that persona and just follow that, because that's what was already being made for him. So if he didn't stray away from that narrative, it would have just felt natural, because that's what we were all reading. But then we discuss it now as well, like seeing how he actually is, it comes as a surprise almost. And I think that's very unfortunate as well, because we put the bar so low that anything that he does is instantly like, wow, what a king, what an angel. And yes, he is our angel and our king, but he's obviously had his own little questionable moments of like, would I have done that? Or maybe I would have done this a little bit differently. And, you know, we've questioned him and like in those kinds of rights as well. But yeah, I think fanfiction definitely had a role in lowering our expectations for not just him, but like men in general, and kind of numbing us to the effects of the patriarchy as well. Yeah, a weird space for girls.
Such a weird space. And I hope that fan fiction is different now. I think that it is, because I mean, I read a heap of fan fiction and managed to avoid those more nastier tropes. But I think that white film directors and white publishing agents still think that is what sells. So I hope we continue to shift away from that. But talking about shifting away from things, I think some of the other things that really marked his transition from boy band to solo artist was just his change in fashion and his change in social media. So crazy different. I mean, the way that he dressed in his like Take Me Home era, actually in all of his eras to now,
eons of change. And I also feel like a lot of that was management suppressing his identity, his style, like who he was authentically. And as I was saying before, how I felt like the first debut album didn't really feel like him. Not that I know on a personal level, but it didn't feel as authentic as Fine Line does. And I think it's very easy to see the difference between the two, because the way he dressed kind of towards the HS1 era was still kind of like in that transition phase of like leaving the band and still exploring and discovering who he was, versus now he's a fashion icon. He's really changed the landscape of fashion and masculinity and femininity, which we'll get into as well, that I feel like he couldn't have done unless he was being authentic. And he's really come into himself from then as well.
Literally, he went from like almost exclusively wearing white t-shirts, black skinny jeans and Chelsea boots to sort of more provocative designer clothes, like blouses, sparkles, pearl necklaces and floral suits have become his trademark. And obviously there have been icons who have done this before him, but he really went from 0 to 100 and we have to love him for that.
100%. And he's actually like my style icon as well.
I love that.
Very iconic. The thing about his style, it like is almost rooted in maybe not rooted in, but it's very inspired by androgyny.
Definitely.
And I really love that it's giving like lots of young people like the agency to kind of be like, oh, well, someone as like, you know, famous and successful as Harry Styles is really like comfortable with himself and like almost giving people the permission to experiment with themselves and their identities and their clothing and stuff too, which I love. And he's almost done that like inadvertently. I don't think he thought it was ever going to be that impactful.
Definitely.
But I love that.
It's infectious. And I think it's interesting that you say inadvertently, because I think the thing that's been really funny, or really interesting, I should say, watching his transition from boy bander to solo member is in part a really strong media strategy, and in part just sort of like accidental things that have happened because of his actions. Like he's someone who's so politicized and yet so apolitical at the same time. And I think a lot of that comes in his social media use. Like he used to, you know, engage in, I guess, like Q&As and follow sprees and just tweet random thoughts and quirky sayings and song lyrics. And we obviously all love that. But he wasn't necessarily very political. And I wonder if that was in part because of where he was in his life, in knowing about certain issues and just sort of sitting in his privilege a little bit without a sort of greater consciousness about that. But also because of management at that time, like the early and mid 2010s, like being political just did not sell, especially if you wanted to be a family friendly band. And with the exception of the video of Louis and Zayn smoking weed, this was a very clean band who managed to have like little to no scandals. So being political was just not really an option, I imagine. And I would say that he still managed to be somewhat political, but that was based off of, I think, him being super clear what his morals were, and being really conscious about promoting positive ideals of kindness and empathy and equality more broadly in a really vague sort of preliminary way. And then now I think it's kind of what I like to call he's developed more soft politics. He's sort of shifted away from morals to being more politically oriented. You know, he's more vocal, be that selective. Like we saw him attend a Black Lives Matter protest.
Yeah, that was kind of game changing. Even though, you know, it like still kind of was like bare minimum kind of stuff that everyone was doing at the time as well. It was such a step up from, you know, we used to see him like wave just pride flags at his gigs and we'd be like, that's cool, that's awesome. But I remember that he would get lots of flack around, you know, not waving the Black Lives Matter flag or, you know, not speaking on the issue. And this would have been 2017 or 2018 or something like that. And then flash forward to now, I think he's realizing that his platform and his voice, and especially his identity as like a white man, presumably cis and straight, is such a powerful voice, especially to be talking on topics of race. And I think him coming to terms, or, you know, awakening to the idea that like he will be listened to because of who he is, not just as Harry Styles, but because of the body that he exists in, is such a powerful, I think, tool that he's kind of awakened to, I guess.
Definitely awakened to. I think there was a real sort of idea that he just wasn't aware of the power he had beyond the fact that he was a celebrity. And I think it was so important to me as a mixed race Black fan to see in his tweet that he addressed that he is not at risk of experiencing the discrimination that Black people do because he exists in a privileged white body, and that he has only been able to do the things that he has and reach the level of success that he has because of the privileges that are afforded to him. I know me and you had a really excited, passionate voice memo discussion, as we do on Instagram, about the fact that it was really important that he encouraged his audience to read and to listen and to get engaged, and that he publicly announced that he was donating money to bail out protesters who had been arrested. I remember us being so excited because we were like, yes, King, we love the anti-police sentiments that were like, it was there in the subtext, you know, like, especially because there was so much divisive dialogue on whether or not people had the right to be protesting, and so much vilification of protesters for being looters and rioters and thugs and criminals, which was obviously just coded in white supremacy, for him to be like, not only am I going to go to the protest, but I am going to bail them out because they should not be arrested. It was siding with them. And I think Black people and Black protesters who are literally risking their lives really needed our support and our solidarity. And so I was like, yes, F the police. ACAB.
He said ACAB with his whole chest.
Whole chest.
I mean, maybe half his chest. But no, yeah, definitely. I think, it's very easy for someone who has engaged with politics very like carefully as to not, tread on any toes or offend anyone, for him to kind of say this anti-police stance was very important, especially to his message. I feel like he could have very easily written a very wishy-washy post about
that. So many celebrities did.
Yeah, that's exactly. So many celebrities did. And it would have easily just sunk into the background as well. Like no one would have really said anything if he did do that. But he was quite mindful in being like, well, if I'm going to speak out on a political issue, it has to be authentic and it has to be what I actually believe. And I want to have an impact on a fan base that does consist of a lot of white fans, but also Black fans and other fans of colour who struggle with race and racial politics every single day. So I think his response was very diplomatic, but also in the right air of what was going on at that time as
Definitely. And I get a lot of people saying to me like, well, why is it important that we know what he thinks about this issue or that issue? And I think it's because when you think of how many hours that you or I and other fans of colour have spent supporting him, we want to know the bare minimum that he would support us back, because quite frankly, I would not be investing all this time, energy and money in someone if they were a white supremacist. He would be just kind of 100%, my soul could just not take that. And so it's important for me to know on these sort of issues that I do feel can't be negotiated on, for me at least, that are, I guess, uncompromisable. It's important to me that we're on the same page. And it's interesting because I just want to read a quote that he said in an interview. I'm not sure where, I can't remember. I didn't write down where it was from, but I'm sure you can Google it if you want to fact check it. While I know this is a different social issue, but he was asked why he waves pride flags at his shows. And he said, I want everyone to feel welcome at shows and online. They want to be loved and equal, I'm never unsupported, so it feels weird for me to overthink it for someone else. And I really appreciated that sentiment because it shows that he doesn't take our support for granted, and that us as his fans are worthy of support, and Black fans definitely needed his support at that time. And I hope this isn't the end of his journey, his anti-racist journey. I hope it's just the beginning. But I definitely think it's worth acknowledging that anyone going to the protests at that time were risking their safety.
Definitely.
Because of the police force and resistance that was being used in America, but also because of the coronavirus.
So many fronts.
Yeah. And particularly those protests in LA, there was a lot of police resistance and there were really high numbers of COVID going around. But then also add in that you're a pop star, very recognizable, very notable. Your safety is also on the line. And granted, that safety is not more important than the Black bodies that needed to be protected during that time. But I just felt as a fan of color, that was a really special moment.
It was. And it was definitely important not to just have him like say his little piece and then retreat back to his den of safety. Like he was out there doing the work as well, like many of us were also doing across the world. And it did feel uniting. And in the quote that you read just then about like him wanting fans to feel loved and accepted and safe, that act from him did also contribute to that. And I'm sure it made Black fans be like, well, yeah, like my time is not being wasted. I'm supporting someone who would support me and is supporting me in the times that I need support as well.
Absolutely. Especially because, going from being a boy band member who had to use media a lot, he now, as a solo artist, really rarely uses social media. He doesn't tweet very regularly at all unless it's to promote his albums or his singles or his concert dates. And so for him to have actually used his influence once was really important. And it reminded me of another quote from another article when he was actually questioned for not using his influence more, which I think is valid. But he said, because of dilution, because I'd prefer when I say something for people to think I mean it. There's a power to doing the one thing. You want your whole weight behind it. So I think his selectiveness, while questionable, I think in this case meant a lot.
Definitely. Because like you were saying, as he mentioned as well, you can raise your voice for everything. And like people who do, I have my utmost respect as well. And I really do appreciate seeing that stuff on my feed as well. But if you have every single person doing that, like with every like story or post that you click, you can just get numb to it sometimes.
Definitely.
And so I think him being quite selective and speaking up for what really desperately needed attention at that time, it worked out quite well for the time and space that we were in at the time.
Definitely. You've been listening to Tender Rage with Sunny Adcock, featuring guest Hebah Ali. This concludes part 1 of our 2-part premiere. Stay tuned for the next part as we venture into discussions about Harry's relationships with women, the female gaze, character-driven masculinity, and that infamous Vogue cover.